information, but everybody will be able to figure out all the other details, lots of them, on their own. Yes, so I think it's 2 minutes to 8, so I think I should still wait a bit. Yes, 2 minutes,
Okay. Yeah.
And then I will present
Lutzen,
you.
actually, I think we can start to make it smooth. I'm so happy we've got 27 participants of today's webinar, and we also streamed live on Facebook. Already 70 people enrolled for meeting with our fantastic guest Evan Frendo. So I think we can start. Lucyna, would you be so kind and tell a few things about our dear guest?
Of course. I would like to start by expressing my personal reflection. During our IATF conference in September, I was a bit shy to approach Evan to ask him whether it would be possible for him, the star of the stars, to have a webinar for us. And then I was told, go to him by some other colleagues. Yes, and it was just like this. Yes, here is my business card, no problem. So that was the first positive shock, and I would like to thank you for this, because it was a very positive experience for me. Okay, so just a few words. First of all, Evan has his own website, and you don't even have to know the address of the website, because it's enough to write Evan Frendo and you will find it. And on the website, you are welcomed by the host. Evan informs you that he is a freelance English language teaching professional, also specializing in bits that's English and English for specific purposes. Right now, you are based in Berlin, Germany, but you travel a lot. Always keep in touch. This is also something very positive that I would like to stress with reference to the kind of person, the personality, this outgoing personality that you have, that I'm really impressed with. And it says also that your expertise is on training individuals and groups to improve their English so that they can operate more effectively in an international business environment. Sometimes you run courses, sometimes you provide consultancy services to international corporations, also you train us, just like today, and you write a lot of materials. And I would like to encourage the participants of this webinar to check it out on their own, especially on LinkedIn. Yes, but on your website, you also provide us with very interesting information about your degrees, like your master's degree for teaching English for specific purposes, your diploma in teaching English for business with LCCI, and bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. That was something that I was especially impressed with. And now a few pieces of information from LinkedIn. The 4 main areas of expertise: consulting for multinational companies in terms of training programs, trainer selection, development, and so on. Then materials writing in terms of in-house projects for multinational companies. And then these companies are enumerated. So if somebody is interested, you may go and see it. And over 20 books have been written by you as an author or co-author, and they are also enumerated on your LinkedIn profile. Also, teacher training, the whole range of courses are mentioned here. And last but not least, I would say a very important for all of us aspect, intercultural communication training to a wide variety of corporate clients, but also to us teachers. So if you are interested in this information, go to LinkedIn profile by Evan. And I'm really glad that you are with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucina. I think I'll hire you for the next training sessions and webinars. Never had such a such a welcome in my life. Normally people say, he's an English teacher and he'll talk about himself. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Lucia. And it's great to be here for IETF Poland. I've been going to IETF events, IETF Poland events for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. It's not far from where I live in Berlin. And it's one of the friendliest countries I know in terms of conferences, as well as very, very knowledgeable and very, very knowing about what people are doing in the English training field, in business English especially, which is my area. What I'd like to do today really is just talk a little bit about task-based assessment in business English and the ESP classroom. So I'm not a testing specialist. I have been involved in testing over the years. I was a chief examiner at LCCI for a couple of years, but for more than a couple of years, for English for accounting, for example. So I have some experience in ESP testing, but what I want to do today is really talk about what teachers can do in their own classrooms, and that will really be the focus. We're not going to be going into any great detail about testing in terms of statistics or you know, deep discussions about validity or anything like that. So this is much more really a skim through some of the key concepts, I think, for task-based assessment, why we're doing it, why it's useful, some things to look out for, and hopefully at the end something for you to take away and use in your own context. At least that's the plan. We're aiming to complete the whole thing within an hour, but if you want to ask any questions, please feel free. I'll be very happy to answer them if I see them in the chat box, as otherwise Martin will collect them and point them out to me later. Before we start, I'd like to know something about you. So could you please just write a couple of words next to your name? School or whatever. Just type. Let's see if we can do that very fast. Great. Okay. Cool. Mixture of people who come to business English and ESP talks and so on, and that is this world we live in, where we have some people who work very closely in company with very specific situations, and some people who are working in universities, perhaps with pre-experienced learners. Perhaps their job is more to cast a window on the business world than dig into it deeply with their learners. And these are quite different areas. Hopefully what we'll be doing today will be relevant to everybody. At least that's the aim. So what I'd like to do first is just remind ourselves what we mean by this word task. It's been around for a long time. I'm sure everybody here is very familiar with the concept of task, but when you start reading up about tasks, you find that there are very different ideas about it. And I think there's a couple of things I'd like to just discuss, just so we're thinking along the same lines. And this is from Jane and Dave Willis's book, 2007. The references are all at the end of the slides, and the slides will be available on my website later. So you don't have to take pictures of the screen or anything. But anyway, this is their idea. Now, you'll probably be aware, Jane Willis was one of the first people to really focus in on task-based learning. There are various people. David Noonan is another one. Peter Skian. Lots and lots of world experts have focused in on this from the 90s, really, 90s onwards. It comes straight from communicative language teaching. And the idea is that there are certain things we can do in a classroom which are not focused on artificial type, language focused type exercises and activities. But it's a continuum, and this is what the two Willises are saying here. So the more confidently we can answer yes to each of these questions, the more task-like the activity. What they're saying is it's not a task, it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray in how we describe this task. So their first thing, of course, is does it engage the learner's interest? That's particularly important if you're in a teaching context. But most of the definitions of tasks focus on the next two. Is there a primary focus on meaning? In other words, are we trying to get meaning across rather than focusing on the language? And is there an outcome? Is there something at the end of the task which is observable, which you can actually pin down? And then how do you decide if it's successful? You might be a brilliant English speaker, but if you go and do a negotiation in Japan and your negotiation is not successful, then the task has failed. It doesn't matter how good your English is. So success is a key factor in task-based learning, task-based assessments. Is it necessary to complete the task? And is it related to the real world? Is it related in some way to the real context our students find themselves in? So why bother using tasks? And there's lots of good reasons. Michael Long, who's another one of the very famous professors who's done a lot of research and written a lot about task-based learning, sums it up, I think, in a couple of nice lines. This was the first one. Little is known about how global proficiency levels relate to task or job performance, and even less about how linguistic abilities relate to task or job performance. What he's saying is CFR level A, B, C, D, E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, A1, A2, B1, B2, doesn't actually tell us anything about how good somebody is at doing their job. All it does is it tells us something about their language proficiency. But if we're in an ESP or a business English situation, we need to know, can they do their job, not do they speak English. That's actually irrelevant. It's important to know whether or not they can do their job. So that's one thing he says. And the next thing he says is discrete point tests of linguistic knowledge reveal little or nothing about the ability to perform real-world tasks. Discrete point tests are things which focus on grammar points, for example, lexical items, vocabulary items, things like that. So and we're all familiar with these types of exercises, every GAPL in the world is in effect a discrete point test. What we're doing is we're focusing on very specific language knowledge, but again, you can do 100,000 gap fills, but you won't know anything about how someone can use that language in the real situation. And that is why task-based learning and task-based assessment has over the last 10, 15, 20 years become so important and so critical to business English teachers. It's a fundamental skill, really. So, in fact, we see this task-based assessment throughout the ELT world. And if you're familiar with IELTS, for example, the International English Language Testing System, very popular all around the world, one of the major tests, plenty of task-based assessment in this exam. If you look at some ESP tests like aviation or the healthcare ones, the OET, which came out very recently or updated very recently, these are using tasks. So tasks are there, they're standard. But what IELTS sees as tasks are maybe a little bit different to what, say, somebody in ESP might see. And certainly in these high stakes type exams, tests, what we're doing is hitting a large population and trying to be very, very accurate in how we assess people. In a classroom, we can become much, much more context specific. But it is a judgment, it is a quality, it's a measure of quality, and it's gray in how good we are at assessing people. So this is really the sort of question we're asking. We're focusing on task-based assessment in the classroom. And this is a classroom I operate in. I work in Korea in the maritime industry. A VTS operator is a vessel traffic service operator. He's somebody who is a bit like air traffic control and brings vessels in and out of harbor safely. He or she, mostly women in the world, do this. And so this is the sort of question we're asking in this sort of training environment, in this sort of typical, very standard ESP course. Is this VTS operator able to handle complex situations in English? Because if he can't, he won't be a qualified BTS operator. So this is high stakes, but because it's only a few hundred of these people do this training every year, you can't put the investment into it that IELTS has and so on. So in the classrooms, trainers like you and like me have to make these sorts of decisions, and it's quite critical that we know what we're doing when we do it. Here's another one. Can I send Mr. Chen to Germany next week to do a sales presentation? Is his English good enough? I've worked in company for many, many years, and this is a very, very typical question. The client or the boss or the supervisor will say, look, can he do it? Is his English good enough? Can we risk sending him? And in a sense, this is a big responsibility for a trainer who's having to say yes or no. And these sorts of decisions affect a company's bottom line. So you've got to really get it right, or as right as you can do. So I want to talk a little bit now about some of the technical words we use to talk about testing. These are technical words which will come up over the next half an hour, and so it's worthwhile just spending a few minutes so we're all familiar with these terms. Validity is the first term. Validity has been discussed and discussed over the last 20, 30, 40 years in detail, and if you know anything about testing, or if you've done any reading on testing, you know how complex a topic validity is. But for the purposes of today's session, validity, we can basically ask the question, does the test measure what it is supposed to measure? So if Mr. Chen is going to go and do a presentation or a sales presentation next week in Germany, and we have to test him to say yes, he can go, or no, he can't go, then are we testing the things we think we are testing so that we can make that informed decision? Is the test valid? And that's the point of validity. Now, there's lots of different layers of validity. The first one to talk about is construct validity. And here, all we mean is, can we infer from the test result that the real world task will be completed successfully? In other words, just because we're doing a test which is close to the real world, can we go back and say, yes, he can do presentations, other presentations, or is it only in that specific context he can operate successfully? So is the construct itself valid? Are we able to make inferences about things from this testing situation, this assessing situation? And then there's something called face validity, and I'm sure everybody here is familiar with this term. Face validity means, does it look like it's supposed to test presentations? So if somebody says, look, I need to do a presentation next week in Germany, and you give him a grammar test, then that has very little face validity. And if the learner or the client knows anything about language training, he'll say, yes, that's a grammar test, but it has no face validity. That's a technical term to say, does it look like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing? And this is really important. And we find it time and time again, especially in language schools, where business English clients come in, pay a lot of money, and the first thing they do is they get a grammar test. And then they get placed at a certain level in a certain group. And the language school is very happy and thinks it's done its job. But those people know that they haven't actually been tested in their business English language skills, abilities. All they've done is pass a grammar test. And we all know these groups, as soon as you start doing presentation training, the grammar test gives you very little idea about how good somebody is at presenting. So these are critical concepts which we have to get right if we're going to do this properly. The next technical word is rating scales. And I'm sure, again, we've all heard about rating scales. Rating scales are basically just a list of levels. So CFR has A1, A2, B1, B2, and so on. And we're all familiar with these scales or bands or marks. It's a way of measuring learner performance. And we normally talk about two types of rating scales. There's lots of different types once you start looking in the literature, but we talk about holistic and analytic very often. Holistic scales make a global judgment about the performance. And this is very much what we're often doing as business English teachers. We're not counting, we're saying, okay, I've been teaching people to do presentations for the last 20 years, and I can make a judgment. I can make a rough assessment that this person is as good as he needs to be or she needs to be. But it's a judgment about a performance. It's qualitative rather than quantitative. An analytic scale, on the other hand, is much more quantitative. You're trying to count. And so, for example, if you look at a school teacher looking at essays in school, they tend to do much more of an analytical scale. They go through and they count how many grammar mistakes, how many vocabulary mistakes, how many whatever their rating scales are, but they come up with numbers, and that leads to some sort of judgment. It's not necessarily judged as a rule of thumb. It's judged much more scientifically, in a sense, much more quantitatively. That's quite difficult when we're in a business English situation and we're testing some very, very specific areas, because to do an analytic scale requires a lot of background knowledge and a lot of work to get the rating scales correct. This is a typical rating scale. This is from Douglas. Dan Douglas is a well-known expert in ESP testing. I strongly advise you to look at his books if you haven't come across him before. This is just one example. So you can see there's a level of ability on the left, and Mr. Chen, this is just a rating scale on vocabulary, and a level 0 is no evidence of relevant vocabulary, right down to a level 4, which is a complete range of relevant vocabulary, a prime appropriately. And of course, you won't only have one rating scale, you'll have several rating scales. And you'll use the combination to make judgments about whether or not people can do certain tasks. Excuse me. If we look at, you remember I talked about the aviation test. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with it. A lot of money over the last few years has been spent developing very focused, very ESP-like tests for the aviation industry for obvious reasons. And what's interesting is over the years, researchers have realized that it's not about teachers. Teachers cannot make any of these decisions by themselves. It's a collaboration between professionals, applied linguists, and interestingly here, politicians. And together they have put input into this design of the test, and they've come up with 6 levels of proficiency in pronunciation, structure, vocabulary, and so on. You can easily just type in ICAO rating scales, and there are thousands of schools offering it all around the world. Just to give you an idea, this is what they have for pronunciation. Pre-operational 3 means they are not good enough and they are not allowed to get their license. Operational 4 is the minimum required to get the license, and this is supposed to happen all around the world. Nobody's supposed to be flying unless they're operational level 4 in the aviation, in the airlines. The reality, of course, is that these rating scales are interpreted slightly different from country to country, which means that communication problems do exist. But in theory, operational 4, if you've passed that, you're good enough at English. And so you can see here the difference between level 3 and 4. This is a rating scale which only looks at pronunciation. So there's many, many rating scales in this exam, but this is one very small part of it. And you can see frequently interfere with ease of understanding is the pass fail really for 3, and operational 4 is only sometimes interfere with ease of understanding. The problem here is define frequently, define only sometimes. These are always going to be the problems. I don't know if anybody in this session are actually IELTS examiners or any high stakes examiners, and you know that there's a severe amount of rater training that goes on behind the scenes just to make sure we all have a rough idea of what these things mean. Here's the grammar part. Errors frequently interfere with meaning, not always well controlled, that's level 3, and operational 4, usually well controlled, rarely interfere with meaning. Yeah. So this is a typical rating scale done by professionals in a high stakes environment. This is not what we're focusing on, obviously, today. I just wanted to show you some examples of rating scales, because we'll have to think about how we can do something like this ourselves in our own classrooms. And the third technical term I wanted to discuss is this word authenticity, which anybody in business English and ESP is fairly familiar with. Again, this is a term which has been pulled apart and discussed over many, many years. This is the famous Widdowson distinction between genuineness and authenticity. So he's talking about texts here, and he says a text is genuine, but not necessarily authentic. Authentic is a step beyond just being an original text. Authentic has to do with the relationship between the text and the reader, and it has to do with how the reader responds to it. And so what Widdowson is saying here is that a newspaper article for something might be genuine, but if you are in a situation in business English where you are helping people to do business type tasks, reading a newspaper is not necessarily authentic in a business English context. It's a genuine text, but not necessarily authentic. And of course, if you see anybody's desk in any company, you'll see a list like this of what people have on their desktop, both on their desktop as a computer or desktop in terms of their top of their desk. And there are no newspaper articles there. And yet, if you go into many, many, many of the big publishing houses, they're very proud to say that they have authentic texts from newspapers. And teachers love using them because they're easy and they might be of interest to people, and they bring up topics which are of interest. But they're not necessarily authentic in a business English context. And we have to think about these things when we're talking about task-based assessment. If we want to have authentic tasks, then it's no good saying to somebody in an exam or in a task-based assessment, read this newspaper article and tell me what it's about, because that's not likely to be real world, with success or failure having a real decision on how business moves on. Now, we've talked about authenticity, and one of the problems with authenticity, of course, is as teachers, we're not really familiar with the world our students are in, or the world they will be in future at university or in tertiary education if they're pre-experienced. And there's now plenty of studies. This is Elga and a whole group of people who researched and talk about task-based assessment within the health sector. That's why there's a picture from the health sector. But the point is that we as language experts can't do it without the domain experts, the people, the insiders, the expert insiders. Let's have a look at this. I'm sure everybody here has taught English for presentations. So let's go into the chat box and just type in one or two things you might use, some typical criteria you might think about when you have to assess a presentation. You might have things like structure or pronunciation, or just type in a few words, please, while I drink my tea. Great, yeah. Looks like we've all... Yes, exactly. These are all the sorts of things which you can use to assess a presentation. They're all, some of them are more language oriented, some of them are more business oriented, more content oriented, but they're all important. And so one of the things we have to think about when we're making these lists of how do we assess this task is what criteria we're going to use and what criteria are we not going to use. Who decides? How do we decide? And what weight do we give to different criteria? Is body language more important than pronunciation? How important is signposting? What about handling questions? Excuse me. And so on. All these things are absolutely correct. These are criteria, and you'll find them in every book on how to teach presentations. But how do you decide? It could be the client, as we've just seen, the client or the client's boss. I would argue the client and the client's boss has an important part to play in the decision-making process, but perhaps the language specialist can also give input. At the end of the day, it depends on who's paying, I guess, so, and what the bottom line is. Here are some possible criteria. I think most of them have been written there already. Aim, structure, content, delivery, visual aids, rapport, question handling, timing. We can go on and on and on. And this is something which I'm sure we're all familiar with. But I did some presentations recently in a company, or presentations training, and I thought the slides were very complicated, a lot of text. All the how-to books on presentations say don't use text. And of course, I asked the expert insiders, the domain experts, and this is what they said. As mentioned, this presentation sometimes also works as a project document, so it has to be a bit in detail. This document will also be used by the team members in the future to look at the details they need. In other words, the genre of presentation really depends on the context. Excuse me. And so very often, and I've watched a lot of classes over the last few years where I go in and observe teachers, and they will quite happily rip into people and tell them that they don't know how to give presentations because there's too much text on the page. But it really depends on the community of practice and how that company and those people actually use this genre of presentations. A typical thing is this Cengage book, which has become quite popular over the last couple of years, on TED Talks. And I see this being used in business contexts all over the place. And of course, those are presentations, but I almost guarantee that they're not the sort of presentations that people give in a lot of business contexts. They may, some business contexts may have that sort of presentation skills, and of course you can extract some of the amazing things that these top level presenters are doing. But a presentation in front of your colleagues or in front of foreign colleagues during a meeting is a quite different thing to a prepared TED Talk, which has been prepared and is absolutely word perfect and very often done by native speakers. There's another comment. Such a detailed product workshop presentation is something desired by the team members. It's not a sales presentation where you only have a few texts and pictures. Sometimes you have no other source of information. You always go back to the project folder and look at the PowerPoint. And so that again was exactly the same situation. I didn't think the first domain expert was quite right, so I sought other advice, and I've got exactly the same feedback from other people. They did not want to do these simplistic one word on a slide, one picture on a slide type of presentations. And it's very dangerous if we start bringing in our ideas of presenting. What we should do is really study the discourse community and the community of practice first, and then help them participate successfully in their own community of practice, not bring in ours. Meetings, that's another very, very common thing in business English ESP classes. Imagine you have to assess somebody's ability to chair a meeting. The boss says, can I send somebody to Romania to run a meeting between all the business partners? Is this person good enough? What sort of criteria might you use there to chair a meeting? Yep. Again, all these things are absolutely right. Knowledge is very important in a business English or an ESP setting. You need to know the B in business English. It's not the English that comes first; it's the business that comes first. But yes, all these things, and of course, Andrea there has written it's a tough one. I haven't given you enough information. There's no way you can make a decision on a specific group here because you haven't done your needs analysis, you haven't assessed the group, you haven't actually watched any meetings in this community of practice and found out how they run meetings. Here's something you might have, and it's again similar to what people have written there: management skills, technical skills, preparation, dealing with distractions, taking minutes. It could be thousands of things, of course. But look what happens if it's a virtual meeting. You can have the same list, exactly the same list, but the elements, the criteria, actually mean something completely different all of a sudden. Technical skills here doesn't necessarily mean the knowledge to run the business. It might also mean the digital skills to be able to help people out with their conference, their virtual world, all the different technical stuff that they need to be able to handle. So yeah, again, it's not possible in our world to make a list of criteria as a teacher without doing a needs analysis. That's what really is the difference between English teaching and ESP and business English. This absolute focus on understanding what the target discourse is before you start planning the lessons. As I said, I've been working in the maritime industry. I'd like to play you a task which we use. You remember I said we have to decide if these VTS operators can actually do the job. So what I'd like to do is play you a typical task which we give them as part of the assessment process. So here you've got a picture of a vessel on fire, and the instruction is you, as the responsible officer, have to send a corresponding message based on the situation. So we're testing their radio procedure. We know that routine type of conversations, type of communications are very simple for most people to do. Almost you can be A2 or B1, but when it becomes tricky, then maybe you need to have more. So have a look at that and think about what you might say on the radio. And think about what is the critical information that the person at the other end needs to receive. Yeah, and you can see we've actually summarized it quite nicely there. That's mostly what must go into the message. So in a sense, this is quite a simple task because a lot of the key information is there. But of course, if you're on this vessel, you will know the name of the vessel. You will know that you have to send the position. You will know that you have to say how many people are on board and what the injuries are. And you have to be able to say what's in those containers. So these are fairly standard things. No, we're not testing them on how to deal with emergencies here. What we're saying is, can you relay this communication? I'm going to play it for you. I hope it comes out okay. And just listen to it, and then think about how successful it was in terms of task-based assessment. Would you pass this person, or would you say,
Taskbased. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is motor vessels Hondo. Victor 9 Kilo Yankee. Mayday, motor vessel Hondo. Victor 9 Kilo Yankee. My position 183. 56.67 minutes south, 10 degree, 04.91 minutes east. I am on fire after explosion. Persons on board 15 and 1 person injured after explosion, badly burnt. My cargo is 6000 T containers. The containers with IMO Class 1 goods. I require urgently assistance. Warning: approach to windward. Over.
So, yes, he did say, I am on fire, I being the ship, so the vessel, so that's okay. Yeah, now this was in a classroom situation. Korean speaker. If you're not Korean and used to Korean English, you may have had problems with some of the words, but he was doing it very slowly, very clearly. He was reading things. So yes, I would agree. He was fairly successful in delivering that, and he passed that particular test. Of course, this shows the sort of situation. You've got very technical language in there, which the teacher might not know unless they've been teaching maritime English. And that's exactly the point. Yes, Andrea, it's very difficult to come in from the outside into a community of practice and make judgments. And that's really what I'm trying to say. Task-based assessment, if you go to use tasks, you have to have tasks which they need, not which we understand as teachers. And so, yeah, that's the critical thing. How do we do it? What I found when I first went to Korea, because I hadn't been teaching there very long, my first impression was they understood their own English very, very well. Everybody in the classroom understood what they were saying, except me. I was the only one in the room who hadn't become attuned to Korean accents. And that really made me think about this whole business of teaching in a monocultural thing, where we teach in Germany or in Poland or in wherever we are. And we get so used to the way people speak English that we forget sometimes that then those people go to totally different countries. They're making a very different impression, only because we're used to it. So we're coming to the end here. What are the challenges? What are the challenges for us really to develop our own task-based assessment? Well, first of all, this access to the target discourse community is absolutely key. If you don't spend time sitting in the meetings your students have to sit in, if you don't spend time watching real presentations, you will not be able to do task-based assessment. You'll be doing something else. If you don't have access to the target discourse community, then you must spend time understanding the professional practice and working with domain experts. But somehow you've got to get access to what is correct and what is wrong. One of the challenges for us as language teachers is separating the language content from the subject knowledge. That case in point was the maritime example I just showed you was a case in point. It's very easy to understand the words, but unless you understand the subject and what maritime guidelines say in terms of how you talk about how you communicate on the radio, you cannot make any judgments. For example, he said persons 1-5, not 15, because the guidelines say that's how you should read numbers on the air. So these are all tricky things with the subject knowledge and language content. We're very good at the language side. We're not so good at the subject side, in my opinion. And then another challenge, of course, is deciding how difficult this is. I mean, was that too easy for that person? Was that too difficult? I'd like to go into this in a little bit more detail. I think we can measure the task difficulty over time. Maybe we need to pilot our tasks, our tests, but we can look at it in terms of task outcomes. That's absolutely probably the first go-to thing. Is the task achieved? Was the outcome successful? But we can also do things like speak to the learners afterwards and say, what did you think? How did you feel? Was that okay? Would that have worked in a real situation? You know, this qualitative sort of opinion gathering is actually very, very important in trying to assess how difficult a task is. You can also check it in terms of time. I did that task with, I think in that session we had something like 50 people who did exactly the same task. And so in that sort of situation, you begin to get a feel for the people who are slow because they're trying to be clear, and the people who are slow because they're just not very good. And so you start making judgments through your own experience. And then, of course, there's observations. The people in the room very often can listen to it, but these recordings are normally played to other people who have not been in the class, and they have to make comments. They have to make judgments about whether or not they could understand that radio message. This is probably my key point. We are not the experts in task-based assessment. We are only one of the players in the equation, if you want to mix metaphor. But the trainer is definitely not able to do task-based assessment on their own, not in an ESP and business English setting. So here's a checklist. This is one thing you could use if you were going to develop your own tasks. You obviously have to develop this for your own context, but these are some of the critical questions I think we've been looking at over the last 40 minutes or so. First of all, is it a real world task, or is it a pedagogic task? Is it a language task? Is it reading an article and answering comprehension questions is not a real world task? Nobody does that in the real world. So what we're trying to do is replicate what happens in the real world if we're doing task-based assessment. From a classroom perspective, can I do it in the classroom? With the maritime people, a lot of their training is done in simulators where we're actually wearing using the typical equipment that they would be using on board a vessel or in their VTS locations. And of course, that's fantastic, but you can't do that in a classroom. So a classroom, there's always going to be limitations. There's always going to be compromise. But how far can you get in the classroom? And then, is the task itself doable? Can they do it, or is it too difficult? I mean, you can say to somebody, yes, give a 45-minute presentation on a technical topic, and they may just not be able to do it. And then the whole point is lost, really. We have to find things which are achievable, which are doable, not which are just real world. Have I checked with the domain experts? I think this is absolutely critical, and I think I've made that point enough. I remember early on when I was writing some in-house materials, and I wrote some role plays and simulations, or I was going to write some role plays and simulations, and the boss of the department who hired me said, "You cannot write these because you don't know enough about it. I will write the role plays and simulations, and then we'll talk about them together, and that's what you do in the classroom. But you cannot write them. I'm the only one who can." And that was very good because I was being paid to write them, and he did it for me. So I was very happy with that. How do we judge success? Do we judge success in terms of language, or do we just judge success in terms of outcome? Very, very tricky. I think in the maritime one, it's very clear. If you get the position wrong, then it doesn't matter if your English was perfect. If you get those numbers wrong and your ship doesn't get help, then you failed. So sometimes there are critical items of communication which are easy to identify, but very often they're not easy. How do you decide if the negotiation was successful because of language or because of something else? There are so many factors involved in these things. And so that brings us to the last point, which is about criteria. How do you use what criteria? We've made some lists today for meetings and for presentations, for example, but this will always depend on the context you're working in, and it will normally divide into criteria which focus on the language, which you're probably going to look at more, and criteria which focuses on the success of the task, which is what your domain experts will be able to help you with. After the task, it's really well worth analyzing how well the task was, because this will build your own experience and it'll help you make better tasks in the future. One of the things, of course, is to look at the task language and see, is it the same as all those recordings you made in the real world? Is your meeting role play similar to the meetings you've attended? If not, why not? Because you're trying to get as close as possible. And of course, finally, and probably most importantly, how successful was the task in predicting performance? So when this chap comes back from Germany, or when this person comes back from wherever they've had to do their meeting, you sit down with them and you say, well, how did it go? Were you able to do it? If not, why not? And how can we assess you better? So those two things, I think, are part of the whole cycle of task-based assessment, looking at it after the whole thing is done and seeing if we were able to predict. Here are my references. I could have put 1,000 more. There's plenty out there. Some of these are available on the internet, some aren't. But I certainly recommend, if you're interested in looking at this, then do have a look. There's some really very interesting research out there on task-based assessment, what works, what doesn't work, lots of good examples. A lot of it is very academic, of course, but without understanding concepts like validity and authenticity, these sorts of things, you can't really start getting into task-based assessment very much. I think you have to spend some time doing the reading. And I know some people in the audience will be very happy with my final slide, because for some people in the audience, it's probably the most important thing I'm going to say. One of the things Lucina didn't mention is that I'm currently the joint coordinator of IATEFL BSIG, which is an organization of and for business English teachers worldwide. We've got 415 members as of today, all over the world. Most members are in Europe, I would say, but we've got people in Japan, in India, in the US, in Argentina, Mexico, all over the world. This is probably one of the biggest groups of business English communities in the world. Every year we have a big event, and this year our event is going to be in Berlin. I strongly recommend, if you're really serious about business English, then you should really think about coming to this, because it's a fantastic event. Just go into the website, the BSIG website, and there's all the details about how to register, how to send in a call for a proposal if you want to speak. Yeah, nothing. There you are. Rob has just put up some details. So that brings me to the end of my session. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments, or yes, but you didn't say this, or that was a bit simplistic, or whatever. I'm very happy with any feedback you've got. Otherwise, thank you very much for spending your Tuesday evening with me, and I hope you found it a little bit useful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Evan. That's great that we had here you for almost an hour. A lot of debate was going on also on IATEFL Poland page. And the main issue was that in order to make the task more realistic, we need to make it more problematic, because if it's simply too ideal, too classroom-based, then it doesn't really reflect the real situation. If something is too simple, it's not realistic.
Yes, I think that's what I was trying to say with the task difficulty. It mustn't be too difficult, but clearly it mustn't be too easy either. But it really depends, because what you don't want to do is assume that everybody at every level can do a task at the highest level. So some tasks have got to be at A2 proficiency or B1 proficiency. If you hit everybody with real world problematic tasks, you have to be at perhaps C1 or C2. So yes, it's a judgment call. I agree. It's you mustn't make them too simple. You mustn't make them too difficult. It's a tricky game. I think the domain expert will come in and say, yes, this is realistic or not. But yeah, sure. I remember giving a task once, just after I think just after I'd done my diploma in business English, and I was very proud of my role plays. And I gave this really lovely, complex task to a couple of engineers, and they had to use engineering drawing, which I gave them to discuss a problem with a turbine. And they looked at this thing and they nodded at each other and they said, and they pointed to different parts on the drawing, pulled out their calculators, did some calculations, and came up with the solution without opening their mouths, because they did the task exactly as they would in the real world. But from a language training perspective, it wasn't particularly useful. It didn't tell me anything about whether or not they could talk or say anything in English. All it told me was that they could do an engineering task. So it's a real balance. There's so many factors in this game. It's very, very tricky. Yeah. But thanks, Marcin. Were there any other points?
I mean, that was the main point. Thank you very much for the for your time. Thank you much for brilliant ideas and insight into assessment. Thanks also for bringing to us the IETFL BSIC annual conference, which is coming to Berlin again after some time. But also I want to remind you that here in Poland we also have BSIC, and we're gonna have the BSIC event this year in May. On 10th of May, we are kind of inviting you to Krakow, where we also can provide you with some nice insights into teaching business English.
Well, I've booked my flights for the 11th of May, so I hope it's on the 11th and not the 10th.
True. You're right. It's 11th. It's 11th.
Great. Lucina is having a panic attack in the background there. Yeah.
I will send you the link to IETFL Poland website. And meanwhile, please take a look into the chat box. There you can see a link to the certificate. And as you will be leaving the webinar, you will be directed to Evan Frendo's website. So please free to look at his resources. Before we say goodbye, let me simply tell you something about the BSIC event in Poland. As Evan reminded me, of course, it's going to be on 11th of University of Economics, and it's going to be second IETFL Poland business event, and of course it's going to be in cooperation with BSIC organizers, Lucyna Wilinkiewicz-Górniak and Jeff Tranta, invite you wholeheartely to this event. And please take a look into the chat. You will see the link to the event on IETFL Poland webpage. Thank you very much for attendance. Evan, would you like to add anything?
No, I think we've said all that needs to be said. It's 1 hour has gone by. Thank you very much, Marcin. You made that a very painless exercise with the technical stuff in the background. So a big thank you to you, without who nothing could have happened today. So well done. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and have a good night. And see you in a month's time, we're going to have another I for Poland webinar. See you.